So this is more about how do we actually do this kind of large-scale open source project, and how do we cope with like EU funding and open source aspects and being completely distributed and all this. And we're going to walk you through some of the aspects. We're not going to talk too much about EU issues because we presume that there's not too much interest in that from the US perspective, basically. Okay, so what is PyPy? That is a question that has been asked several times at the conference, and we still try to answer it. We believe it's kind of a next generation Python implementation. It's a Python implementation in Python itself, and you're going to hear much more about the technical issues in the next two talks, the status and the architecture talk. It is a grassroots open source effort, and it's also a partially funded research project from the European Union. The technical aims of this project are building a flexible and speedy Python implementation, or actually a host of Python implementations. PyPy is doing is building a system where you can generate custom Python versions. For example, also stackless versions. There's also another aim which is focused around sprint-driven development. This is where Bea is coming in and telling you a lot about how this relates to other concepts of development, also regarding Agile development. How did PyPy start as a process? There was an initial sprint, 2003 if I remember correctly, and there were a couple of people who met previously at a conference, and they got together and decided, okay, we all spent a couple of days, like 4 or 5 days together, and that was prepared by mailing some mails between people. And we had like the people who did, Rigo, who did Psycho and Stackless, Christian Tisma, with us. And the original project name actually was Minimal Python. So the idea was also to build Python versions which are very minimal. But then we had a huge thread on compiling Python, and then basically this evolved into the name PyPy, Python and Python. What is very important that we early agreed on having a focus on correctness of concepts and then speed. And basically in the last year we got to the point that we have that correctness, and now we're going for more speed. The style of development we are doing, it's not so uncommon these days anymore in large Python projects, is that we do test-driven development. And that means that we always try to identify problems and then code this in a test, have that failing, and then go back to actually make the implementation of the code pass the test. And we have also our own testing tool that is evolving also with the project, and that's called PyTest. And again, this test-driven approach was very much aiming at getting the concepts right first. Today we have around like 3,000 tests. Actually take a long time to run, and we also have to do some stuff regarding having this done in a daily manner and reported on the website. That's also upcoming soon. So what is PyPy with respect to the EU funding or the money? Everybody believes that PyPy is a funded project, so that all the people that are actually working on the project receive money, just like so. This is actually not completely the case. The first 1.5 years of the project were financed by the developers completely, including travels, everything, spending their time working out of their own pockets. No funding whatsoever. That was actually when a major part of the project evolved. Then it can also be claimed that even at the moment it isn't a completely funded project. At the same time, it also is a funded project. Then we have, on the EU level, we actually have 8 organizations. These 8 organizations are together in a consortium. There are 7 companies and 1 university. And they got together end of 2004, basically, to sign a contract with the European Union. And the people that started the project were actually working through these organizations. Some of the organizations were actually created in the context of this EU funding. And it's very unusual that you have in an EU research project 7 companies and 1 university. Usually it's more the other way around. So that's also a special aspect. I mean, these organizations have to give basically guarantees that they fulfill the contractual obligations with the EU. So that's ongoing pressure, and the project is lasting, this kind of project, this EU project is lasting until November 2006, so it's ending this year. Then what is interesting and very unusual for an open source project is that we had to come up 3 years ago, basically 3 years ago, we had to come up with a 2-year plan of the work we're going to do. We are now in the second year of that plan, but actually the negotiations about this also took a year. At some point we have to think about how does this project go on after the EU project period, and that is these thoughts are now going to start. But overall, the plan of work that we're doing is giving us some focus. If you consider all this, you have like an open source effort, people involved, organizations, EU, contract, whatnot, then it's a complicated thing in some sense. You have a balance of interests, and also the EU has its own interests and what you have to prove to them. And of course we still, because that's how the whole project started, want to have it so that we as developers actually can drive the technical project and are not like just commanded from somewhere what to do or so. And that so far works quite well. And also we have this issue that companies have to co-fund 50% of the costs. And some of the developers actually have to care for that as well. The EU wants these challenging goals. And in the end, if you consider all these aspects, it's about individually and adaptively finding solutions for cooperation across all these various interests. So I'm not going into details here, there's of course lots of anecdotes, but it's basically the intentions of everyone involved are well, right? There are good intentions everywhere, but still you can have lots of friction between the various interests involved. And so it's actually sometimes hard work to make all this matching on a management level. One word about the current, how do most of the developers that work on PyPy work actually? We have, I think, inspired from Canonical or so, they do this as well. We have weekly 30-minute synchronization meetings on IRC. That means we meet each week for from, I don't know, 12:30 to 1 o'clock or so. We meet, and that is a moderated meeting with like decision points, and all active developers go there. And there's minutes of these meetings, and this time limit is very, very useful there. And still we have this open collaborative work style, so people from all over the world can and do participate to a certain degree. And we have, within the EU project, we have the developers basically represented in a kind of a trusted technical board. These are basically the people that started the project or are very much involved in the core. And they have a formal role in the EU project, which, where they can also drive a bit of the technical issues and react to problems in the way they think is reasonable. And we also, it's not like we have like someone who directs everything. We are like a bunch of very diverse people, and the research and the architecture is basically led by multiple people, and also depending on the areas. I mean, we have like logic and constraint programming, which is led by different people than the just-in-time compiler issues and the back-end issues that you're going to hear about in the next talks if you come there. And so we have basically a dispersed or distributed leadership there in various areas. And of course, you always have like 4 or 5 people at least that try to really keep it all together. That's also, especially for the next 9 months, going to be quite a challenge. So the main method for doing all this is sprints, and that is actually where Bea During enters the picture, and we'll continue to talk to you about this.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about the Agile aspects, and so far Holger has presented an open source culture and then the EU stuff, and how on earth do we make sure that this is Agile? Well, if you look at the Agile Manifesto from 2001, they actually stress the people factor a lot. You know, in open source projects, it's very much about integrating, testing, and releases, and etc. But it's very much about the people factor, the core values. And this quote from Coburn and Highsmith is very good, I think, to just keep focus on creating a process that lets each individual and each team find and use their own unique strengths. This is what it's about. So when Holger said balancing interests, this is creating a process for this. Now, if you look at open source nature of teams, yes, of course, especially as far as I understood in the Python community, they are self-organized, they are intensely collaborative. Just take PyCon organization as an example, right? This fits the Agile approach very well. But in some sense, open source teams are also very unique and may not really fit the Agile approach at all. And the reason for this is because open source teams are distributed. And they are not only distributed, they are also dispersed. And the definition of dispersed is, we're not a team sitting in different locations. We're one person in South Korea, one in Brazil, one in Sweden, one in Germany. This dispersed development is actually on the fringe of not fitting within the Agile paradigm at all. And there's actually research going on in the Agile community about this. Does this really fit? And if you talk to Ken Beck, extreme programming, he has very strong opinions about this. So how do we make this fit? So sprints is the key technique for us to manage and balance interest on all these levels. Not just the open source aspects, PyPy was grown through a sprint, but also the EU work and also the actual organization of the partners. So if you look at where sprint come from, now if you go to the Agile community, not the Python community, but the Agile community, they will say that a sprint comes from the Scrum technique. A sprint is 1 month-long iteration, when we should do a specific thing in one location, and the team focuses on one thing, one increment. And they have meetings, and they document this in a sprint backlog, and then after 1 month, they evaluate, and then they're finished, and then they start planning a new sprint. This is their definition of this word. But if you talk, as in the Python community, if you ask people, to them a sprint is maybe 2 to 3 days, or here at PyCon after the conference, a 4-day sprint, in which various teams meet up and code. A very focused, accelerated development session. So in that sense, we need to go back to the Agile community and say, hey, look what we've done with your techniques. Look how open source teams are actually evolving the Agile techniques. And there's a strong interest from the Agile community to listen into this. So, and in that sense, the different implementation projects and the different projects in the Python community that are sprinting are doing it in their own ways. But everyone's quite heavily influenced by Soap Corporation and the mini guide. But in PyPy, because we have our EU funding and we identified very early that sprints are a key technique, we evolved our own way of working with sprints. So not many other projects can sprint every 6th week during a 2-year period. We're blessed in that sense, but we'll have to pay the cost, as Holger says. So we have different versions of sprints. You have the first contact sprints around conferences. So if we're doing a sprint at EuroPython or PyCon here, we focus very much on tutorials and getting people into understanding what PyPy is about. Now we also have core sprints, like when we were in Heidelberg and when we prepared the Open 7 release in August, and etc. So those more focused sprints, really weird in-depth work, those are more core sprints for reaching milestones. And what's also unusual for PyPy, we actually sprint for 7 days. So there's a 3-day break day, and that's 4-day break day, 3 days. So for 7 days. So when we meet up every 6 weeks, it's actually a 1-week intense work period. Which also it's good for us, but it's also a bit bad for maybe people visiting us from the community, because staying away from work or whatever for 1 week could be a troublesome thing, right? Now we've also evolved our own focus and techniques. Like if you look at the SOAP version of sprinting, they have formal roles like the coach. In a PyPy sprint, we do not have a coach. In the PyPy sprint, we're rotating between developers in the team. Who's going to organize the sprint and who's going to manage it, and it varies during the sprint and between sprints. And it's very much based on who has the local contacts. And we also try to move around in different locations to sprint in order to meet up local communities in different areas. And that's also been a very good strategy to actually enliven the community and make sure that PyPy comes to you. And do you have any questions? Do you want to get on board? Typical activities, we have daily planning meetings in order to keep people focused. Approximately, most sprints in PyPy have around 10 to 12, sometimes we've been up to 20 people in a sprint. So having some kind of status meeting to just make sure where the different pair are and how they're proceeding and which ones to switch pairs and do other things. That's important. We also have this kind of closure meetings in which we actually look at the work until the next sprint. So we plan roughly the work between the next sprint and the rough topics for the next sprint. So in that sense, we're kind of moving into the Scrum thing, because the end sprint period, the time between the sprint and the next sprint could be one iteration in some sense, you could call it. We're also trying to do tutorials because we have people visiting our sprints that is not part of the consortium organization, and we try to encourage this a lot. And so we try to be helpful in that sense, to make them get up to speed. And because, as Holger said, we're progressing quite rapidly, the learning curve is steeper and steeper. So we've updated our tutorial, and please come tomorrow, and we'll do our best to help you. We're also looked a bit about this pair programming thing, and we've done pair programming a lot. But because we're quite many people in our sprints, and we have core developers, we started to identify more group discussion-oriented versions of coding together. So we're evolving this, and it's a part of the methodology objective, as Holger mentioned. And we're actually documenting this and reporting this to the EU, and the idea is, of course, to make sure that our findings and our learning by learnings, etc., is something that other projects, both commercial and open source projects, can use. Yes, a picture that shows the subscribers on PyPy Dev, our main development list. The blue dot here is the actual PyPy Dev list, and the red line here is the people subscribed to the commit list, who actually follow the commits and via email. And you can see here, December 2002, that's when this first talk started, you know, among Holger and Christian and Michael and Samuel and Armin. And, you know, it was quite fairly stable until end 2004, when we received our funding. And there you can see a quite rapid increase, because we're sprinting much more regularly. We have our releases, and that has made a huge impact on the community, we hope. And as you can see here, there's actually is an effect. So today it's approximately almost maybe 300. That's also interesting to see. And if you can see also the amount of committers following the commit, it actually doubled from the non-funded part of the time till the funded part of the time. So hopefully, because we're active and doing lots of stuff, people get interested in following the project. So, as Holger said, this is about balancing interests. We have different cultures in the project. We have the open source culture of the core team members who started the project, but we also have people like me coming in. I'm a Project Management Institute certified. You know, that's plan-driven. You cannot get more plan-driven than a PMI certified project manager. That's like the enemy camp in some sense. So it's very much about balancing. And then also we have the EU requirements. So we have to balance there as well. So of course we have diversities in our team. And it's a challenge to manage these diversities. Now, we will present 3 of these main diversities, and these are actually constant challenges all the day, every day during these 2 years, to keep a focus here. The first one is that we want to have a developer-driven process, the way the project started, right? We want to have that, but we want to have it in a formal project organization that fits the requirements from the EU, in which we can track costs and time, whatever. So that means we have to create an official structure for a management team and a technical board where the core developers are keeping cohesion in the project in the technical sense, but also the partners. And we are organizing sprints, and sprints is a key technique for the funded part of the project to coordinate. So we need to do this, but also it's a key technique for keeping a dialogue open with the community as well. And then we also have to have some kind of rough planning and timelines, which might have not been that important before, but it sure is important when you have deadlines and milestones towards the EU. So in that sense, in order to keep this balance, we're very heavily dependent on our core developers to be this kind of user interface between the community and the actual EU formal organization of the project. And they had to do quite a lot of work, and they're by now experts in the EU law and experts in the judicial and contractual aspects of EU. And it's, of course, a challenge for us to make sure that they are also able to do what they're interested in, you know, to let Armin work on the JIT, let Holger work on a bit more on PyTest, but yeah, stuff like that. Other diversities, besides this developer-driven versus the formal organization, is the agile strategies. The project started and wants to work very agile. It did that before it received funding. How does this fit into a formal EU requirement where you have timelines? Well, it's very difficult to make changes to the actual contract. So when Holger described the technical work, the description of work, that is in our contract. That is what we said we would do. If we want to change that now, 2.5 years later, we'd have to make an amendment to the contract. So in that sense, we have our high-level requirements that are, you know, great ideas 2.5 years ago, and we need to see every time, do we want to keep on this track, and what would a change mean to us? So in that sense, we're in a risk of, you know, this is inertia for the project, because we're risking opportunities maybe to react to change and also create change in the project. I've seen quite a few open source projects in which the core developers are sitting on everything, you know, and they have this clear vision of what they want to do, and they're very grateful if people submit bug reports and do things, but they're not allowed to influence the actual design ideas. So in order not to kill the community by closing the door because we're funded, we also want them to be able to participate on all levels of the project. So even influencing, of course, the strategies on the technical level. So we have our PyPy dev list, we have our core developers in the technical board, but we also have a community right now asking us for, yes, this is all very good and research-oriented, the stuff you're doing, but when are we going to get this? When are we going to get that? So it's a balance between the interests of the community and the actual outspoken requirements. And of course, we actually love that kind of discussion, and people are very active and pointing out things where they want us to go. But we need to strike a balance because we're contractually obliged to things as well. So there's a risk of unbalancing the community. Now, Hitchhiker's Guide to PyPy. You know, in some sense, putting a man on the moon, 1961, was a far-off idea. Building something purely Python in Python is weird and unnatural, right? But this is the man on the moon for us. This is PyPy. It's going to be a compiler on the moon, a JIT on the moon, and we have to keep a focus on this all the time. And we have to be able to spread this vision as well and make sure that people share it. And I think, as Holger mentioned, that we have to get better at this, make sure people understand what our vision is. So the learnings for now is, of course, you need to not only have this challenging vision, and of course it's challenging because I mean lots of people out there who say, this is weird, what are you doing? So of course we've proven that it's challenging. We think we have a proof of concept already, you know, the Open 7 release we thought was a proof of concept, but we also need to share it. We also need to be much better in explaining this to people. So if you are interested and if you have questions, please approach us because we want to get better at this. We want not just the EU part of the different partners to understand this, we want the community and also other communities to understand this. And this is also about creating respect for each other, you know. When I come into the project, I wasn't part of the open source aspect. I come in, I have my experiences, my strength, but also my weaknesses. Is there an interest in my skills, being a non-technical person at all? And then we have other people in the project that are skilled and have other experiences. So we need to create some kind of process in which we let people use their strength and somewhat manage their weaknesses as well, right? So it's a difference of cultures. I think only from a work style perspective, we have like 4 or 5 different style of cultures that are involved in the PyPy project. So in order to do this, you need to identify what is the lowest denominator that we have to do from a process perspective. You know, the lowest denominator from an EU requirement, the lowest, and making that match the way we want to work Agile, the way we have to work distributed, and making this fit. So not only minimal Python in a technical sense, but also minimal PyPy in an organizational sense. And then also, it's not Agile if you're not constantly evaluating what you're doing. That's also one of the parts of the Agile paradigm. If you're not learning and exploring the way you could do things better, you're not really working Agile. So we also have to make sure that we have discussions going on. Can we do this better? Not just talks and conferences and sprints, but actual development work and improving and refining. Do we want to keep on doing sync meetings? Do we want to report in this way or not? This is a constant discussion. And it's about creating change, not reacting to change. And that is really the tough Agile challenge of things. So, just to summarize things, we have 9 months left of the funded part of the project. Hopefully there will be quite a large PyPy community out there that will continue for years and years and years after the funded part of the project. But we have our big deadline here, November 2006. We also need to focus on improving interaction with the community because of these managing diversities challenges I just mentioned to you. How can we get better? How can we make sure that people understand how to use PyPy now, not after the project? And sprints is a key technique for doing that. So we try to travel around and make sure that we actually meet the people that we think are interested in what we're doing. So, and also exploring commercial opportunities. I mean, of course we would like to continue to work on PyPy. After November 2006, our funding from the EU is ended. But then is also when the shiny JIT in the sky is supposedly going to work on a level that we can actually start to get implementation out of it. So in that sense, we have busy 9 months left, and Now I will thank you for bearing out these process and social aspects of the project. I know you're all waiting for the technical tough talks. So thank you for listening out. Now you have the organizational context on why we're progressing at the speed we're doing. Thank you.